Hi everyone, this is Bree. I presented at the September QCE Psychology Head Start lectures and for the biology and chemistry ones, and today I'm going to be bringing you this video where we'll cover some of the key concepts we looked at during that lecture and examine those. So, what specifically are those topics? Well, we're going to cover bits from all these four, and then at the end we aren't really going to have time to go into scientific skills, but we'll just do like a brief kind of flick through, and then if you have any questions about any of this, I'll link you to how you can get some answers to those. So, starting off first with divisions of the nervous system, we can divide the nervous system into the peripheral nervous system and the central nervous system. So, the central nervous system is just your brain and also your spinal cord. So anything that's not your brain or your spinal cord and is part of your nervous system, that's in the peripheral nervous system. And the names are actually pretty intuitive because if you look at the central versus the peripheral nervous system, the central bit is here, like, you know, in the center, whereas the peripheral bit, it's on the periphery of the body. So that all kind of makes sense. So what happens with these, how they work together, is you have the peripheral nervous system get information about the environment. So that can be your external environment with things like vision, hearing, tactile, all that kind of sense stuff, but also information about your internal environment. So your blood pH, for example, is under tight control, and the peripheral nervous system would get information about that. The central nervous system receives all of this information about the external environment. It's going to integrate it, make decisions based on it, and then kind of go back and send out commands for the peripheral nervous system to enact. We can then divide the peripheral nervous system up into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So I like to remember these by thinking somatic. I know that the word soma means body, so if you think back to when you were doing like your neuron diagrams in units 1 and 2, the soma of the neuron is the cell body. You can use that if you weren't familiar with soma in this sense before, and I think of this as anytime I choose to move my body, that's the somatic nervous system acting. So anything where we're having this like voluntary, controlled, conscious process, that's going to be the somatic nervous system at work. On the other hand, we have the autonomic nervous system, and autonomic sounds kind of similar to automatic, and that's how the autonomic nervous system operates. So these are the automatic balancing processes that are happening. For example, I talked before about blood pH. You're not consciously going, oh, you know what, I think I want my pH to be a little lower now. I'm going to release some of these hormones to take care of that. Your autonomic nervous system just does it for you. And we can look at this into two more pathways, because of course we need a subdivision of our subdivision of our subdivision, and we look at sympathetic and parasympathetic. Now, one way to remember the distinction between these is I like to think parasympathetic, parachute. The parasympathetic nervous system is kind of slowing things down, whereas the sympathetic nervous system is energizing. So the sympathetic nervous system is going to be active when we have our situations of stress. So when we have high arousal, like in terms of physiological arousal, just to be clear that I'm using the term in the like more kind of psychological, scientific sense. When we have like our fight-flight reflex, that's done by the sympathetic nervous system. Anything like that where we're going to be using up our resources at a faster rate, because we really need to deal with what's happening now and how we can cope and get the best out of it. Whereas on the other hand, we do also need to recover from that. We need to build up our resources. So our parasympathetic nervous system is also like rest and digest mode. So in this, we're going to have a bit of a lower heart rate. We're going to not be releasing so much sugar into our blood. We're going to be like building up like kind of energy reserves and doing like all of this in the state of like normal functioning. So you should remember like a few examples of differences of different parts of the body and how they react compared to when you have the sympathetic nervous system dominant or the parasympathetic nervous system dominant. So for example, with how dilated our pupils are, we would expect our pupils to be more dilated, so the pupil appears larger, or like you could also frame it as the iris constricting, and when the sympathetic nervous system is dominant, and we can explain this by it's more important to have a lot of information about our external environment in these kind of high stress, high pressure situations, whereas in the parasympathetic nervous system we would expect our pupil to be more constricted or less dilated. Now I'm going to jump back to the central nervous system and talk a bit about the brain and the spinal cord. So first off, looking at the spinal cord, one of the things that the spinal cord does is it can initiate the spinal reflex. So in the spinal reflex, what's happening is we have some harmful stimulus, and then the message about that is sent through the peripheral nervous system. It goes here to this point where like everything kind of in this box is in the CNS, and rather than sending the message up to the brain as the spinal cord would usually do, what happens here is the interneurons in the spinal cord are going to intercept this message, and they're going to make the decision, okay, we're initiating a spinal reflex now, and actually send out instructions to effectors themselves. So for example, if you have a burn and like you've whacked your hand on a hot stove, then this message about this like extreme heat and like cell damage and everything goes into the spinal cord, and then it's going to instruct your arm muscles to contract in particular ways so that your arm is pulled away. And so in this case, it's your arm muscles that are acting as the effectors. Now this arrow here, this is indicating that the message does still go to the brain. So the brain is still informed, it's told what's going on, kind of like as in, like, you know, oh, FYI, you're burned, might want to do something about that. But it's not actually going to be carrying out the instruction to move your arm away, that's already done. And this is a good like time-saving mechanism. So if you think about it, if you've like getting that high levels of damage to your skin through a burning process, you don't want to wait. So they have the stimulus, it then passed along your sensory neurons going to the spinal cord going up along afferent pathways to the brain, and then down along efferent pathways, and then going to the effector. It just takes too long, so we just go stimulus, spinal cord, spinal reflex effectors, and it's nice and you deal with it quick, minimizing damage. Now if we focus more on the brain, you might notice that I talked about messages going to the brain as afferent. I like to remember that through like at, because it's like at brain and then a for afferent, whereas when the messages are going away from the brain, this is when we're having our efferent pathways, our efferent messages, and so I like to think of that as like E for exit. Okay, the brain itself, we're getting there. This has a variety of components. You can see there's lots of labels on this screen. You don't need to memorize all of them, so please don't do that to yourself. But we're going to look at now a few of the different areas that are responsible for motor functioning. So you do also need to know about some other stuff. For example, you should hold on to all of that like language stuff you learned in units 1 and 2 with like Broca's area, Wernicke's area, Schwinn's territory. That's important in unit 3 as well, but since you do have a bit more prior exposure, just motor for now. So looking at this, we can go to the cerebellum in the hindbrain, which actually contains about 80% of the brain's neurons in it, and the cerebellum has a huge role in like balance, postural stability. You know, staying upright is kind of nice, kind of useful, given that we're bipedal, we like walk on 2 legs. It's great, and also for your like procedural learning, for your like motor learning, if you want to be able to like shoot your shot in like basketball and you like practice doing that, your cerebellum has a really key role there. But the cerebellum isn't working on its own. You do also have an area, you have the basal ganglia, which is really kind of a mix of different areas, and depending on like the source you're looking at, it can actually describe different parts as being in there. But one of the key parts you're concerned about in the basal ganglia for QCE psychology is the substantia nigra. So the substantia nigra produces dopamine. This is an excitatory neurotransmitter, so it's a neurotransmitter that's going to increase the probability of a neuron firing, and it's very important in your voluntary control. So when you have there's like neurodegenerative disease known as Parkinson's disease, and in Parkinson's disease there's damage to the substantia nigra, which then means that you're not getting all the dopamine you need, you have a neurotransmitter imbalance there, and then this has a bunch of flow-on effects in terms of your ability to like control your voluntary movements and have those all go as they should. Alright, so going back to the basal ganglia more broadly, the basal ganglia is important for initiating and also inhibiting movements, because if you think about it, being able to move, great. Also being able to not move something when you don't want to move it, fantastic. So like if you're having uncontrolled movement, such as in like Tourette syndrome or in Parkinson's disease, if we're going to reference that again, then you can link this back to the basal ganglia and what's happening there. Third of all, we're going to look at a portion of the cerebrum. So in the cerebrum, this like big giant white kind of bit here in the forebrain, you can look at just the outside layer of that is called the cerebral cortex. And in the cerebral cortex, you have 4 lobes. So typically this is 4 lobes per hemisphere. So you do also have like the temporal lobe on like the other hemisphere of your brain and all of that. Do keep in mind that some areas, such as going back to like Broca's area, Wernicke's area, they're only on the left hemisphere, they're not in the right hemisphere. You can get some hemispheric specialization and some differences there. In terms of motor coordination, a bit here that we're particularly interested in is the primary motor cortex. So this is here on the frontal lobe, and in that you have different sized areas allocated to different parts of the body, and the size of the area allocated is actually going to depend on the sensitivity of control there. So this is similar to in the parietal lobe when you look at the somatosensory cortex. So that's kind of about like feeling your like tactile stuff, knowing where things are in space, your like reception. The somatosensory cortex has different areas allocated depending on the level of sensitivity of like kind of your receptors there. So if you have like your hands, for instance, you have a whole bunch of receptors, so you would expect and the amount of information there, you can have a large area in the somatosensory cortex compared to something like the middle of your back where you don't really get that much information. And then, you'd see that mirrored in the motor cortex, where because you can move your hand in like a lot of different ways with fine control, or you probably can, then this means you're expecting a larger area there. Now I'm just going to jump ahead. I know we're passing through a bit, but as I've said, go download these slides off the ATAR Notes website. Ask me any questions on the forums you have about them. Do feel free to go through the whole thing and then ask if you're unsure. We're just going into topic 2 now, visual perception. It's important to note that this term perception actually has a set specific meaning. So when you're perceiving something, a necessary part of that is that you're interpreting it as well. So if you, for example, can get all the visual information about what's happening, but you don't understand it, you haven't given it meaning, then that means it's only visual sensation, not visual perception. So that's a distinction you definitely need to be aware of. Now we're going to go through these kind of 5 stages just through looking at a cross-section of the eye. So if you can think here, this is like the front of the eye, you're getting all this like light coming into the front, and then you have the back of the eye like over here. So you have the kind of the rest of your face, so kind of like above and below and all of that. Now if we look at the pathway that the light's taking, it's going to go through into the eye. There's a few different fluids and everything it goes through, passes through the pupil, goes through this bit here where we have the lens, and then the ciliary muscles which are controlling the lens. And then the light is going to continue onwards, go through the fluid in here to hit the retina. So like this light blue shaded component on both of these bits. It's the retina, really rich in photoreceptors. As you might guess from the name, photo meaning light, receptor being, well, a receptor. They receive light, and then what the receptors do, not just reception, but they also do transduction. So they need to take that light stimulus and change it into an electrical signal that's going to be able to be passed on by the neurons. Because remember, neural communication is electrochemical. So the receptor is going to do this process of transduction, get the electrical signal, which can then be transmitted along the optic nerve by a whole bunch of different neurons sent into the brain. And then we can have selection occurring where we pick out important features using feature detectors, see what are the patterns, what are the kind of trends that are going on here, and then we'll have organization and interpretation where we're actually starting to piece together and make sense of this visual information. So it is like quite a bit of a process, and then going into organization, there's a few different perception principles we can look at to help us understand how this occurs. So I'm just going to run you through 4 Gestalt principles, starting off with similarity. Similarity refers to things being similar and grouped together for that reason. So here we're grouping together these diamonds because they have similar shape and similar color into a diamond, whereas these circles, they have similar shape and color to each other but not to the diamonds. We're going to group those into a square. We can also look at it this way, where we have the hollow circles versus the solid circles. On the basis of the similarities in being filled, we group this into columns rather than, say, into rows. Another Gestalt principle we look at, in addition to similarity, is proximity. For example, here we can see these dots are all quite close together, and we're able to group them into a smile. Similarly, this dashed line, or quite similar, we're going to group those. Now, another Gestalt principle to be aware of is closure. So when we look at this like kind of triangles and circle shapes, we don't actually have edges for the white triangle, but our mind like realizes they're there anyway. It fills in the gaps, so then we're able to make that complete image out of incomplete information. Another example you can see is here with this sphere with the spike sticking out. We don't actually have anything drawn, we can't see a like white sphere, except for the fact that we're piecing together this missing information where the spikes aren't, to then interpret it in that way. Finally, we can look at figure ground organization. So in figure ground organization, we pick something like a figure, and then we recognize that that's separate to the background or to the ground. For example, this image is like an interesting demonstration of figure ground, because you can actually interpret the figure and the ground in 2 different ways, which makes it a reversible image and one type of ambiguous figure as well. So in this reversible figure, you can look at this dark blue as being the figure, in which case you see a goblet, or you can look at this white here. If you look at the white as being the figure, then you see 2 faces on a dark blue background. Now, one thing to note is that ability to interchange figure ground makes it a reversible figure, which is a type of ambiguous figure, but you do have ambiguous figures that don't just work on being a reversible image. So for example, this image here, you can see either an old lady or a young woman. It's an ambiguous figure. It has like multiple distinct interpretations, but that's not because of how you swap figure and ground, so we wouldn't classify it as a reversible figure. I'm now going to move on from visual perception and just go right ahead. So Next we have memory. And just since this slide is here, I will say that even though the Year 12 program started on the 12th of October, if you are still interested in TuteSmart, the 2-week trial runs. Okay, so I should probably actually explain what TuteSmart is. The way it works is it's a tutoring program, but on top of that, it's also about getting support from like students who have gone through the same thing as you, and then having access to additional resources, practice tests and exams, etc. So the way it works is that you pay $44 a week, or it can be like kind of buy in bulk and save if you're doing multiple subjects. And you have the weekly subject classes, but you also have practice test exams, class recordings in case you happen to miss one, and then access to things like Edu Unlimited. Now, Edu Unlimited, if you're unaware, it's a digital platform where you're able to access all of our course guides, topic tests across Queensland, Victoria and New South Wales, and that's quite useful because there is actually a fair bit of overlap in the syllabus. So then in addition to getting your QCE specific resources, like there's a QCE psychology course guide that's going to be coming out, may have already come out by the time you see this video, and then once it does, that's just going to be added to Edu Unlimited as well. On the other hand, if you do want physical copies of course guides, that's not included in TuteSmart, but by all means you can go to the ATAR Notes website and order one in. Now, from that, we're talking about like classes which can be useful in learning and memory, but let's now go into what the psychology syllabus has to say about learning and memory. One of the key models that we consider in this is the Atkinson-Shiffrin Multistore model of memory. So it's called a multi-store model because we have these 3, aka multiple storages of memory. In it we look at sensory memory. This is where we're getting the information that we're consciously aware of in the external environment. So for example, we can look at iconic. So I like to think of this eye as being like an actual eye, because this is our visual information about the environment. It doesn't last for very long, but it does have unlimited capacity. So this allows us to see things fluently, and if it didn't have any duration, then our vision would appear a lot more like jumpy, because we wouldn't really be able to fill in the gaps or smooth things out as we move, which is automatically done for us nicely enough. We also consider echoic memory, so I like to think E for ear or echo, like echoes are pretty clearly related to sound, and then this is our auditory information that's coming in. So that lasts for a bit longer, 3 to 4 seconds, also has unlimited capacity, so that's like pretty sweet there, although, you know, really because it's not long duration, you're probably not thinking about the capacity of it so much. There are other forms of sensory memory as well, like haptic, but you don't really need to worry about those. You need to know about these two and like their durations and capacities. So if we consider this, short duration, huge capacity, that's what sensory memory is all about. Then if we actually pay attention to something in our sensory memory, we can put it into short term. So short term lasts for up to 30 seconds. So that might not be as long as you're used to thinking about in terms of short-term memory. So if you're trying to think back to like what you ate 12 hours ago, that's not actually short-term memory, that's long-term memory, when we use the terms in like as psychologically like valid way, where we're considering the jargon rather than just casual talk, so make sure you're aware of that. And then the capacity is 5 minus 9 items. Often people will write this as 7 plus or minus 2, so if you see this, that's just the same thing, don't worry about it. Once we manage to get something into like our attention, our working memory, our short-term memory, we can then encode it and put it into our long-term memory, which we consider to be unlimited in duration and unlimited in capacity. So that's a pretty nice deal there. You may be going, hang on a second, but I forget stuff. Don't worry, you will investigate forgetting as well in Unit 3. We're not forgetting that forgetting happens. It's just we would still consider long-term memory to be unlimited in these respects. There are, however, some quite valid criticisms of this multi-store model of memory. A lot of them tended to focus on this short-term memory component, which people say was a bit too static, wasn't really explained well enough. So then along came the working model of memory, which breaks down short-term memory into different components. So in this working model, it's quite dynamic, like things are happening. It's not just this little like storage box where sometimes you push something out. And the way it's organized is that you have this master system of the central executive, and then the central executive like delegates to three like what are known as slave systems. So one of them is the phonological loop. So if you're familiar with the term like phoneme as a unit of sound, then this will make sense. Or you might just think of phone, like you can call people on the phone and use that to remember it. Then when you have like that inner ear or like voice in your head, or you're like thinking about stuff you can hear, pay attention to what like someone's saying when they're talking to you, all of this you can attribute to the phonological loop. So next time you've got a voice stuck in your head on repeat again and again, blame that. Then you also have the visuospatial sketchpad. So visuospatial, this considers visual things, so like what you can see, but also spatial, so like what are the arrangements of things in space, what is their locations. You can use this as well, like for visualization is a strong one. So if you are able to like picture what your house looks like or what someone's face looks like, then this is using your visuospatial sketchpad. Now, information from both of these, as well as from long-term memory, is combined into this episodic buffer. So the episodic buffer takes this working memory, and then it's useful for consolidating things into your episodic long-term memory. At this point you might be going, well, what is episodic long-term memory? You can think about it relating to the name. If you consider like what the episodes of your life are, like the different things that have happened to you, the stories of like who you are and your experiences, that's what episodic long-term memory is all about. So then if we go more into different types of long-term memory, you can consider episodic as a type of explicit memory, also known as declarative memories. You can kind of like declare you have them, you're like very aware of the information in them. And semantic memory is another subtype. So in semantic memory, this is more like things that you remember and are a bit more abstract or not as like personal to you. So if you remember that the year Australia was federated in is 1901, and that like you know what happened on the 1st of January, like all of that stuff would be semantic. If you like were old enough somehow to remember actually being there when it happened, and then you're remembering like what that day was like, that would be episodic. You can also look at implicit forms of long-term memory. Implicit memories we're not so consciously aware of, but nonetheless they are quite important. You don't really need to know about the other types of implicit memory and how they fall in. For example, like classically conditioned reflexes are a type of implicit memory, but they're not mentioned in this part of the syllabus, so I'm just going to talk about this. In your procedural long-term memories, this is like remembering how to do procedures or like sequences of actions that you can take. If, for example, you know how to ride a bike or you know how to like do a like good serve in tennis or like any of that, this is coming under your procedural memory. Even things like being able to walk and run, that's in your procedural memory as well. So far we've focused a lot on breaking things down into like long-term, short-term, and also sensory. But if we go back, you can also consider memory using the levels of processing model. And in this levels of processing model, rather than thinking about like different kind of structures that memory can move between, you're thinking more about the processes of memory. In this, we consider two different types of ways you can process memory, and we say that the deeper you're processing a memory, the longer a memory trace is going to last. So in our shallow processing, where we're looking at structural processing, so we're looking at the physical features or the visual aspects of an object or of like, for example, reading text, then this would be considered shallow and not likely to last particularly long in your memory, whereas we can also look at deeper forms of processing where it's going to last longer. In deep processing, you're looking at semantic processing. So processing with meaning, you're using elaborative rehearsal in order to link this information to other sections of information. And just I'm going to go back. You may remember from the phonological loop that like phone being related to sound. That is the case in this model as well. When we talk about phonemic processing, that's auditory aspects. So both structural and phonemic, looking at maintenance rehearsal rather than looking at elaborative rehearsal. In maintenance rehearsal, you're kind of just repeating the same thing over and over, and it's not considered to be particularly effective if you want to remember something long term. Right now, there are a few different structures involved in memory which you should become aware of, but at the moment I'm going to go into retrieval, just because this language here can be a bit confusing. We look at different types of retrieval and how sensitive they are. So relearning is considered the most sensitive measure out of these three, and what that means is that it's most likely to demonstrate evidence of the memory existing, whereas if you're using least sensitive measure out of these three, which is recall, you're much less likely to actually show evidence for the memory. So in recall, this is kind of like if you have a short answer question on a test, you're not given a list of alternatives or anything, it's just like, what year was Australia federated, and then you have to remember it was 1901. Whereas in recognition, they might give you like, was it 1901, was it 1900, 1902, 2007, and you would just have to pick which the right one was. Relearning, on the other hand, that would be if you learn something faster and or with fewer errors compared to when you have learnt it before. So if you are doing your practice tests and you're getting a higher score on them, then this could be used as evidence of relearning and thus as evidence of retrieval and the memory existing. Something that people often get confused between with recall and recognition is that if you have cues, that can be a feature of recall. It doesn't necessarily mean that recognition is going on. So for example, if you have this question set up and it's Susie is looking at a picture of different members of her family, and then she uses that picture to help her remember what her family members' names are. In this case, we would say that Susie is using recall unless she's actually been given a list of the names along with that picture. And that's because she still isn't picking from a list of alternatives, she's just using a cue to help her out, and cued recall is a type of recall. So we would only say recognition, again, if there was some kind of writing that came along and had those names. Alright, moving forwards, we don't really have much time to go through this, so I'm going to jump into learning. Now there's going to be three main types of learning you look at: classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and social learning. Classical conditioning is the most passive out of those three, and it's also the only one out of those three where you're looking at something where it's an involuntary behaviour. So let me explain a bit more with an example. Pavlov's dogs and the whole ring a bell and saliva thing, that's often used in classical conditioning. What you're looking at more in QCE as your example is little Albert. So what happened is you had this boy named Little Albert. These researchers, Watson and Crick, were wow, he's not really scared of anything, he's so stoic. Let's see if we can make him be scared of this white rat. So what they did is they noticed that Little Albert was scared when they banged this bar, which had a really loud noise, prompting a fear response. So what they then did is they took Albert and they presented him with the rat, and then immediately once they gave that to him, they would also strike the bar. So he would have that bar and hence have the fear response. But after they kept doing that again and again and again, what actually happened is you didn't even need to strike the bar. You could just give Albert the rat and he would be like, nah, I'm out of here. He would be fearful, trying to crawl away, and like all of that. Yeah, it wasn't really the most ethical experiment, as you may have glimpsed from that. Didn't really have withdrawal rights. He was also like a toddler, and there's not really much mention of him getting parental approval or anything. But yeah, if I focus more back onto what was going on here, using the terminology, although do learn the ethics, it is actually something you can get asked on. We have an unconditioned stimulus of the bar. So because he's having the reaction to this without conditioning, therefore it's the unconditioned stimulus. And the fear response here, that's not a conditioned one, so this is the UCR. Then at the start, this white rat, this is a neutral stimulus because he's not having some particular involuntary action in response to it. Then those continue to have their roles during conditioning, where you're associating the response, like having that bar fear becomes associated with this white rat, and eventually you get the rat being a conditioned stimulus because now he has a conditioned response of fear to it. Now when you're talking about the conditioned response, it's very important that you link it as being the response due to the presence of the conditioned stimulus. So if we had, for example, a question and it was like, what was the conditioned response in the experiments involving little Albert with Watson and Crick, and you just said fear, chances are you might not get the marks. But if you described that it was the fear response he displayed when being presented with the white rat alone, then that's definitely the conditioned response there. So just be careful around that. With conditioning, you can have generalization and discrimination. So when we're considering conditioning, they're kind of opposites. Generalization is if that learnt behavior is then carried across to other similar stimuli as well, whereas discrimination is if it's not. So for example, if little Albert is fearful when a white fluffy Santa hat is presented because it's white and fluffy like a rat is, then that would be stimulus generalization. Whereas if he's not fearful in response to that, because he can go, hang on, that's not a white rat, then that would mean he was displaying stimulus discrimination. Again, this isn't really a conscious process going on. With classical conditioning, we really are looking at a lot of involuntary things, but that helps explain the difference. Over time, if you kept pairing the conditioned stimulus and then the conditioned response is occurring, you might expect that over time the response is going to decrease in intensity or decrease in how frequently it's displayed if you're not then using the bar to kind of redo that conditioning. And then once that response is no longer shown, we would say that extinction has occurred. However, after extinction is thought to have occurred, if you don't present the conditioned stimulus for a while and then you present it again, sometimes you can get spontaneous recovery, where spontaneously they're showing again the conditioned response for this conditioned stimulus. In operant conditioning, we are looking at voluntary behavior, so you have some kind of antecedent, some scenario, situation, stimulus, which is prompting a response. Then you have a behavior, and then there's an outcome from it, which we call the consequence. There's lots of different types of consequence. We look at 4 different ones here. I don't know, maybe 4 is not that much, but it can seem like a lot to remember. And what people often get wrong here is they think, oh, negative, that means bad. But really what positive and negative refers to in this sense is, positive is if you're adding a stimulus, you're adding something to the situation, whereas negative is if you're taking something away. So you're removing a stimulus and you're getting rid of it. Or if you want to say whether something will increase the behavior or decrease the probability of the behavior occurring, that's what reinforcement and punishment describe. So for example, in negative reinforcement, you're taking away a stimulus and it's going to be an unpleasant stimulus, so that you're increasing the probability of behavior occurring in future. Sometimes negative punishment is known by another term known as response cost. In both cases, you're looking at something is being removed in order to decrease the likelihood of the behaviour being repeated. So, for example, a parent might take away a child's phone in order to decrease the likelihood of them doing something. The most active form of learning we would consider to be social learning. So in social learning, as you can see, there's a fair few different things involved, and this all is dependent on a fair few factors as well. It's important with this, as with any other psychology question really, that you're linking quite strongly to the scenario, and I would encourage you to do that in every step, not just at some point in the question, but throughout the whole thing. So for example, let's say Bob is trying to learn how to do serve in tennis, and his coach is teaching him. He's more likely to pay attention to the model, which is his coach. If he likes the coach, if the coach is the same gender, if the coach is someone who he views as being competent in that particular ability, and then if he is paying attention, make sure you use the word active. It's not something passive here. He's really trying to pay attention and have this sink in. Then in the retention step, in order for him to actually learn, he needs to remember. So in retention, the learner forms a mental representation of the model's behaviour. In Victoria, they're really quite strict about using forms and mental representation, and if you use language other than that, they'll penalise you. I don't know if that's the case in Queensland, if it will be the case, but just thought I would put that out there. So in this case, it would be Bob forms a mental representation of his coach, so completing the tennis serve. Maybe you can tell I can't play tennis. Alright, then in reproduction, this is where he can potentially demonstrate that he has undergone this learning by converting the mental representation into action. So in this case, Bob converts his mental representation of his coach doing the tennis serve by doing the tennis serve himself. You can have reinforcement here as well, which is going to impact motivation. In reinforcement, you can look at this both as Bob being reinforced, so maybe he's if he wins a game due to the new serve and gets points from it, then that's probably going to be some reinforcement going on there, where it's increasing the probability of him doing that serve. But you can also have vicarious reinforcement. So for example, if his coach is constantly praised on his serve, then this can vicariously reinforce Bob, where because he's seeing that reinforcement occur to his coach, he's also reinforced. You could also have it go the other way, if Bob's coach is told, look, your tennis serve really isn't fantastic, you should change it, then Bob's going to be a bit less likely to be reproducing that behaviour, or even back at the start to be paying active attention to it. So it really kind of flows through all of the stages. That's just about all that we have time to cover. I have put some slides on scientific skills in here. I've also got a post on the forums which talks about things like when to pick different statistical tests, so you can just go and look at that if you want. I have dropped down a link here to get to the psychology section of the ATAR Notes forums. Using the forums, making an account on there, all of that's absolutely 100% free, so don't stress about that. And if you go in there, I'll try and answer any questions you might have. Do definitely feel free to contact me. Feel free to check out ATAR Notes' other resources. For example, there's a bunch of free psychology notes that you can look at and download off there, so you just need to log into your account, and you can also do things like read our articles, watch different videos on topics, all of that. It says here essay marking, and you can also put up other things if you want to practice writing a operationalized hypothesis, for example, you can put that up on there and get feedback on that as well. So essays are something people tend to be quite stressed about, so that's a decent draw, but really doesn't have to be an essay. Happy to give you feedback on things. Obviously can't do your assignments for you, but happy to help where I can. I hope you've enjoyed this and gotten something out of it. I'm going to leave you there, but as I've said before, definitely feel free to keep in touch. We are also on social media if you want to look there. Farewell and bye!